June 3, 1944, near the village of Trévieres, Normandy. The night was unnervingly quiet. A pale crescent moon hung above the hedgerows, casting long fingers of silver light across the open fields. From the darkness came a low, rhythmic hum, not of engines, but of generators hidden beneath camouflaged netting. Lieutenant Fred Fox crouched beside a map spread over the hood of a jeep, its edges pinned down by empty ration tins. Around him, a handful of men, artists, sound engineers, set designers, whispered orders to one another. They weren't soldiers in the traditional sense. Their weapons were rubber, their artillery made of canvas and air. But tonight, they were the tip of the Allied spear. Fox raised his hand as a truck backed into position. The vehicle carried what looked like a massive, deflated whale, an inflatable Sherman tank. Within minutes, the crew fanned it open and attached an air hose. As the compressor roared to life, the tank began to rise from the earth, its silhouette swelling under the starlight. From a distance, it looked perfect, heavy, metallic, ready for war. Miles away, German reconnaissance planes droned overhead. Their cameras clicked in the darkness, capturing grainy photographs of what appeared to be an entire U.S. armored division assembling near the French coast. The Luftwaffe pilots didn't realize it was an illusion, one crafted by painters from Hollywood, sculptors from art schools, and engineers who had once built stage sets instead of battlefields. As dawn approached, the camp came alive. Men strung up laundry lines with fake uniforms. Mess tents puffed smoke through hidden chimneys. A convoy of half-tracks, all rubber, rolled into place. And from massive loudspeakers came the distant roar of engines, the metallic clatter of tanks, the shouted commands of imaginary officers. Fox checked his watch. Everything was synchronized. By sunrise, German intelligence analysts would be convinced that an entire U.S. division, the 1st Army's 2nd Armored, had appeared out of nowhere. In truth, the real 2nd Armored was miles away, preparing for D-Day. The deception here would draw enemy divisions north, thinning the defenses along the actual invasion beaches. At 500 hours, the first light broke over the horizon, illuminating rows of ghostly tanks. The illusion was flawless. Even the shadows fell correctly, carefully aligned by stage designers who once worked on Broadway. In a farmhouse on the other side of the valley, a German observer raised his binoculars. He saw what he expected, columns of American armor stretching to the treeline. He scribbled notes, his pulse quickening. Within hours, this false intelligence would reach Wehrmacht headquarters in Paris. And so, without a single shot fired, the Ghost Army's first act began, a war fought not with bullets but with imagination. The morning air smelled faintly of diesel and damp grass. A soft mist clung to the fields as the men of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, the Ghost Army, moved quietly among their creations. Each man had a different background. Some had studied art in New York, others had designed Broadway sets or worked in advertising agencies before the war. Now they wore olive drab and carried sketchbooks instead of rifles, brush kits instead of grenades. Lieutenant Colonel Ralph Ingersoll, a former magazine editor turned deception strategist, stood beside Captain Douglas Fairbanks Jr., the Hollywood actor serving in naval intelligence who had helped recruit creative minds for psychological warfare. Together, they had envisioned something audacious, a force that could conjure armies out of thin air and make the Germans chase shadows. Nearby, Sergeant Harold Dahl adjusted the angle of a canvas half-track with a carpenter's precision. He stepped back, squinting at the inflatable vehicle in the growing sunlight, then dabbed a bit of mud on the rubber treads to make them look used. "If it looks too clean," he muttered, "they'll know it's fake." Behind him, the sound crew worked their own magic. Using massive wire recorders, they played loops of truck convoys, tank engines, and the chatter of soldiers. The recordings had been captured weeks earlier from real American units, and now they echoed across the fields in carefully planned directions. A passing observer might swear an entire column was on the move. Private Stanley Meltzoff, once a painter in New Jersey, took notes for adjustments in shadow and contrast. "We're fighting a war with light," he said quietly, sketching a silhouette on a clipboard. "They'll see what we want them to see." Each operation had to be timed with surgical precision. They would deploy at night, set up their decoys, broadcast fake communications, and vanish before the Germans could react. Everything depended on illusion and speed. Sometimes they had less than 12 hours to build a phantom division and make it believable enough to fool enemy reconnaissance. By midday, an order came from headquarters. A German unit near Caen had begun repositioning its artillery based on new aerial intelligence. It worked. The Ghost Army's fabricated 2nd Armored Division had drawn enemy fire away from the real invasion corridor. In a small tent, Fox and his radio operator exchanged coded messages, pretending to be part of a major armored command. Their transmissions were intercepted, decrypted, and analyzed by the Germans exactly as planned. The men laughed quietly at the absurdity of it all. They were soldiers playing a theater of war, their battlefield a stage of deception, yet behind every smile was a sliver of tension. If they were discovered, the consequences would be immediate and deadly. One wrong move, a misplaced shadow, a reflection off rubber where steel should be, and the illusion would collapse. Enemy artillery wouldn't distinguish between real and fake soldiers. The Ghost Army's war was fought without gunfire, but every mission carried the risk of instant destruction. That night, as fog rolled in from the coast, the sound crew began dismantling their loudspeakers. The men packed up the rubber tanks, deflating them into neat bundles. Within hours, the field returned to silence and emptiness as if no one had ever been there. Far to the east, in a German operations room lit by flickering lamps, officers pored over reconnaissance photos. They debated the sudden appearance and disappearance of what seemed like a massive U.S. formation. Reports contradicted one another. Some officers argued it was a trick. Others insisted it was proof of a new American deployment strategy. Confusion spread like wildfire. The Ghost Army had done its job again, vanishing into the fog, leaving behind nothing but questions. March 1943, the sands of Tunisia stretched endlessly beneath a blazing sun, each dune a canvas for shadows and mirages. Long before Normandy, the concept of the Ghost Army had been tested in North Africa. Major General John F.H. Jack Lee oversaw the early experiments, studying how illusions could force Axis units to move where no real threat existed. In a makeshift desert camp, teams of engineers and artists labored under the sun. They inflated massive decoys of half-tracks and artillery pieces, their rubber surfaces painted with meticulous camouflage. The desert wind threatened to collapse the creations, so ropes and stakes anchored each phantom vehicle with painstaking care. Sergeant Harold Dahl, now seasoned from weeks of field trials, measured distances with a surveyor's eye. He positioned shadows carefully, knowing that aerial reconnaissance would judge depth and size based on subtle cues. Every fold of canvas, every angle of light had to mimic reality exactly. Nearby, a sound team had mounted speakers atop dunes, playing recordings of tank engines, marching troops, and radio chatter. To any enemy observer, it was as if an entire division was encamped in the barren landscape. Yet in reality, only a handful of men controlled the illusion. Lieutenant Fred Fox and his unit observed through binoculars as German reconnaissance planes circled above. They timed their movements perfectly. Each unit shifted slightly to mimic normal activity. When the planes returned to report, Axis commanders were convinced that a full armored corps had established positions in the desert, ready to strike at any moment. This misdirection proved immediately effective. German and Italian commanders redeployed real units, diverting them from key strategic points. Supplies were rerouted, artillery positioned incorrectly, and plans based on non-existent threats. The Ghost Army had turned illusion into a weapon, and the battlefield responded as if the phantoms were flesh and steel. By evening, the men sat under a sparse canopy, exhausted but exhilarated. Paint-streaked faces reflected relief and satisfaction. "We may not fire a single round," Fox whispered to Dahl, "but we've just won a small war with nothing but shadows." These desert trials forged the methods that would later astonish German commanders in France. They learned the delicate balance of realism and misdirection, mastering inflatable tanks, fake radio networks, and controlled soundscapes. Each operation honed skills that would soon be used on the grandest stage imaginable, the fields and hedgerows of Normandy. As the sun sank behind the dunes, the phantoms disappeared into the twilight. The real troops advanced elsewhere unseen, while Axis eyes continued to follow illusions. Each successful deception reinforced the principle: perception could be as powerful as firepower. The lessons of the desert stayed with the men, engraved in both technique and confidence. Every shadow, sound, and silhouette had a purpose, and the stakes in Europe would be far higher. June 5, 1944, just hours before the first Allied troops stormed the beaches, the fields of Normandy were alive with illusion. Fog clung to the low hedgerows, and the faint smell of damp earth mixed with oil and canvas. From a distance, German observers saw lines of tanks, trucks, and artillery stretching across the countryside. Each vehicle, each column, was meticulously positioned to suggest the arrival of entire divisions. Lieutenant Fred Fox and his team moved quietly among their creations. Inflatable Sherman tanks loomed like silent sentinels, half-tracks and jeeps arranged as if preparing for a massive offensive. Soldiers dressed in American uniforms mingled with the decoys, waving to reconnaissance planes, while radio operators transmitted orders in carefully coded chatter. Sergeant Harold Dahl adjusted the placement of a rubber artillery piece, ensuring that the angle of its barrel caught the morning light in a convincing manner. Nearby, the sound crew played back engine noises and troop movements through massive loudspeakers hidden among hedgerows, making the empty fields seem alive with activity. Every sound, shadow, and movement had been rehearsed to perfection. Above them, German reconnaissance planes circled and clicked their cameras, recording the movement of armored divisions that did not exist. Officers in Paris and Caen pored over the photographs, tracing columns that seemed to stretch endlessly. They debated troop strengths, repositioned artillery, and diverted forces away from the real landing zones, all based on what was essentially a theater of shadows. Captain Douglas Fairbanks, Jr., watched from a hidden ridge, binoculars trained on a cluster of fake Sherman tanks. He smiled faintly, noting the precision of shadows and the play of sunlight across canvas turrets. Every detail mattered, too little realism and the illusion would fail, too much and it might draw unnecessary attention. In the villages nearby, residents saw trucks and soldiers moving through the fog. Some took cautious glances, unsure whether these were real units or yet another Allied trick. The Ghost Army relied on these subtle cues to reinforce the authenticity of their deception. As the sun rose higher, the Germans shifted more units north, convinced that the 2nd Armored Division had arrived to strike at Caen. Entire divisions were moved away from Utah and Omaha beaches, thinning defenses in the zones where the real invasion would begin. The Ghost Army's work was silent but decisive. Men, sound, and rubber had reshaped the battlefield without a single direct shot. Fox checked the time. The invasion forces were still hours from landing, but the Phantom divisions were already causing real effects on enemy deployment. Every moving shadow, every recorded roar of engines had drawn attention and resources that the Allies needed elsewhere. The tension in the field was palpable, yet each member of the Ghost Army understood that their creativity was now a weapon as lethal as any rifle. June 6, 1944, German headquarters in Caen was a maze of dimly lit rooms, maps pinned to walls and officers scrawling furiously with chalk on tabletops. Colonel Heinrich Strauss stared at the latest reconnaissance photos, his brow furrowed. Across the images stretched what appeared to be hundreds of American tanks, trucks, and infantry formations converging from multiple directions. "Where did they come from?" he muttered, tapping a finger on the photo of a rubber Sherman seemingly advancing toward the North Ridge. His staff officers whispered among themselves, theories forming and dissolving in rapid succession. Each report contradicted the last, and no one could confirm whether the divisions were real or fabricated. In the field, German patrols observed what they thought were full battalions moving into position. They radioed warnings back to headquarters, only to have the information filtered, delayed, and misinterpreted by command. Confusion mounted as orders were issued to reposition artillery and infantry units to meet threats that did not exist. Meanwhile, the Ghost Army maintained perfect discipline. Every inflatable tank, every half-track, and every blaring recording was timed precisely. From hidden perches, Fox and his officers adjusted silhouettes, repositioned rubber vehicles, and ensured that every sound emanated from the correct direction. The deception was seamless, a living puzzle designed to manipulate both eyes and ears of the enemy. Captain Douglas Fairbanks, Jr., signaled to a squad in the tree line and they shifted a Phantom column a few meters to the east. The move was subtle, almost imperceptible, but through German binoculars it appeared to be a significant redeployment. Messages intercepted by the Germans reinforced the illusion. New commands from non-existent divisions, simulated radio chatter, and the echo of engines across the valley. By late afternoon, German commanders were issuing contradictory orders, sending units in opposite directions, and holding back reinforcements for fear of being trapped by forces that didn't exist. Each decision was influenced by phantoms crafted from canvas, paint, and sound. The battlefield was being shaped by imagination more than by firepower. Back in Normandy, Fox walked along the hedgerows, surveying the scene. The men moved like shadows, deflating and repositioning decoys with meticulous care. Each element reinforced the illusion for the next observation flight. Every detail was a calculated stroke in the grand design of deception. German officers continued to argue, unaware that the armies they feared had no weight, no men, no ammunition. Every decision they made played into the hands of the Allies. The Ghost Army had become an invisible hand on the scale of war, guiding outcomes through misdirection and ingenuity alone. June 7, 1944, the sun rose over Normandy, casting pale light across fields still dotted with inflatable tanks and silent half-tracks. Along the beaches, the real Allied troops had already begun pushing inland, facing the harsh resistance of German fortifications. Yet in the northern sectors, resistance was lighter, slower, confused. German units had been drawn away, chasing shadows created by men armed only with paintbrushes, canvas, and clever engineering. Lieutenant Fred Fox watched from a concealed ridge, binoculars tracing the paths of German convoys diverted to respond to phantom threats. The sight was surreal, columns of trucks and armored cars moving urgently toward decoy positions, while real soldiers advanced elsewhere with a fraction of expected opposition. Every maneuver confirmed the careful planning, timing, and artistry of months of preparation. Behind the lines, Captain Douglas Fairbanks Jr. coordinated sound teams, replaying engine noises and artillery fire in patterns that mirrored real troop movements. The Germans intercepted the signals, recording them as legitimate reports. Messages between phantom divisions reinforced the illusion, orders being relayed, supply requests logged, and troops reporting positions that had no reality. Each echo of sound became another thread in the tapestry of deception. Sergeant Harold Dahl moved among the inflatable tanks, touching up mud-streaked surfaces and adjusting the angles of shadows. Every detail counted. A misplaced shadow or reflective surface could betray the ruse. Yet the men moved with practiced calm, executing rehearsed routines perfected in North Africa and southern England. Their skill was not in combat, but in precision, perception, and psychological manipulation. By midday, reports from German headquarters revealed mounting frustration. Units that had been sent to counter the phantom divisions were now exhausted, dispersed, and unable to reinforce the front lines where the real invasion was unfolding. Divisions had been split, artillery mispositioned, and strategic reserves committed to empty fields. The Allies were capitalizing on a battlefield shaped more by imagination than ordnance. In a farmhouse overlooking the field, German officers muttered about phantom armies and unreal divisions. Some suspected deception, but fear and uncertainty kept them cautious. They could not risk ignoring reports of armored columns even when the evidence seemed contradictory. Every decision was slowed, every movement second-guessed. The Ghost Army had transformed confusion into a weapon wielded invisibly yet with lethal effect. Fox lowered his binoculars, satisfaction hidden beneath a calm exterior. The men had executed the largest deception operation in military history, diverting enemy forces and securing critical advantages for the real assault. And as the first reinforcements of the 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions pressed inland, the invisible victories of canvas, sound, and shadow rippled silently across the battlefield. July 1944, weeks after the beaches of Normandy were secured, the fields once filled with inflatable tanks and phantom divisions lay quiet. The men of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops moved on to new operations, each mission building on the lessons of deception and illusion. Yet the impact of their work continued to ripple through the Allied advance, shaping battles without ever firing a single shot. Lieutenant Fred Fox sat in a temporary headquarters, sketching diagrams of future decoy layouts. He reflected on the ways shadows, sound, and perception had bent the enemy's actions to the Allies' will. Every inflatable Sherman, every broadcast of engine noise had been a brushstroke in a larger painting of misdirection, and the Germans had unknowingly contributed to the masterpiece. The men were no ordinary soldiers. Captain Douglas Fairbanks Jr., still in uniform, recounted stories from the field to new recruits, describing the art of deception as if telling a theater tale. He emphasized timing, subtlety, and observation, the same principles that had made phantom divisions appear real enough to mislead high-ranking generals. The recruits absorbed every word, understanding that in war, ingenuity could match firepower and its consequences. In Paris, German commanders reviewed intelligence reports from Normandy. Frustration lingered in the notes. Entire divisions had vanished, reinforcements had been misallocated, and positions misjudged. Even after discovering the existence of inflatable tanks and fake radio signals, the magnitude of the deception left them in disbelief. The Ghost Army had reshaped the battlefield with ingenuity, leaving a mark that could not easily be erased. Back in England, soldiers of the 23rd trained tirelessly for future operations. Lessons learned in Normandy were refined and expanded. Decoy convoys, fake airfields, and controlled soundscapes became essential components of Allied strategy. Each exercise reinforced one truth: that perception could dictate action, and that the mind of the enemy could be a battlefield in itself. Among the men, there was quiet pride but also humility. They had fought and won in a way few would understand. No medals marked their efforts. No cannon fire echoed their victories. Yet every German unit diverted, every artillery piece misplaced, every hesitation caused by doubt was a testament to their skill. The legacy of shadows endured beyond Normandy. As the Allies pressed deeper into Europe, deception remained a vital tool. Future operations would echo the methods honed by this unique unit, and the story of inflatable tanks, sound recordings, and theater-trained soldiers would influence military strategy for decades to come. Late July 1944, the countryside of northern France was a patchwork of shattered villages, bombed-out roads, and slowly advancing Allied columns. Amid the chaos, the Germans were still reacting to the illusions they had chased weeks earlier. Divisions that had been diverted by phantom armies now found themselves out of position, their supply lines stretched thin and their communications disrupted. Lieutenant Fred Fox moved through newly liberated fields, noting the positions of decoy equipment left behind for observation. Even deflated, the remnants of inflatable tanks served as psychological traps. German reconnaissance flights occasionally spotted them and reported supposed troop activity. Each sighting forced enemy commanders to consider the possibility of reinforcements, slowing their movements and creating pockets of hesitation. In the command posts of Caen and Carentan, German officers struggled to reconcile reports with reality. Some officers began to suspect deception, but uncertainty made decisive action impossible. Orders were delayed, units shifted defensively, and opportunities to counterattack the real Allied forces were missed. The Ghost Army's impact persisted in the minds of commanders long after the initial operations. Sergeant Harold Dahl and his team returned briefly to adjust a few sound positions. Through hidden speakers, they played low engine hums and intermittent gunfire, simulating activity where none existed. Even a faint echo in the distance could convince the enemy that a full brigade was approaching. The battlefield had become a stage, and the Ghost Army's illusions continued to shape the performance. Meanwhile, Allied intelligence noted the effects. Reports confirmed that misallocated German divisions were unable to mount coordinated defenses. The invasion forces had gained crucial time to consolidate beachheads and advance inland. Every hesitated movement, every delayed reinforcement, and every misdirected column was a silent victory for the men who had fought with shadows. Fox paused at a small ridge overlooking a ravine. The view was deceptive. To the naked eye it seemed empty, but he knew the echoes of past illusions were still guiding the enemy's decisions. The success of the Ghost Army was not in immediate destruction but in the persistent confusion it sowed. Every German calculation was subtly influenced, every movement shaped by creativity, strategy, and careful misdirection. The men packed their final equipment, leaving behind only footprints and the faint memory of activity for those watching from the air. The battlefield bore the invisible marks of their ingenuity, ripples that would continue to affect operations for weeks. Even in retreat and regrouping, the Germans carried the lessons of fear, doubt, and uncertainty instilled by the Ghost Army.